Now that you're familiar with secondary corrections, let's look at a new tool that was introduced in Resolve 17 called the Color Warper. As per usual, make sure Lesson 20 is open in order to follow along. We'll be working with shot 06, so make sure it's selected in the thumbnail timeline. Let's open the scopes to analyze the image. The dynamic range looks evenly distributed from the shadows to the midtones, but the whites are clipping. Drag the Gain Master wheel until the brightest pixels are sitting below the maximum level for brightness in the scopes. Press Option or Alt-S to add a serial node. In the Tools palette, click the spiderweb-looking icon to bring up the Color Warper. To open it in a floating palette, click this icon, then move it around or resize it as needed. The Color Warper is a mesh-based warping tool that allows you to select colors on a grid, then warp them into another color. But unlike the HSL curves you worked with in the previous lesson, the Color Warper lets you simultaneously adjust two parameters at the same time by selecting specific hues on the mesh. You can either work with hue and saturation, or you can choose chroma and luma. In this lesson, you'll be working with the hue and saturation mesh. You can select points on the mesh directly, but the most intuitive way to use the tool is to move your cursor over the area in the image you want to affect. Move the cursor over the red gas tank. A yellow box appears over the closest grid point that will affect that color. Click and drag in the viewer. Dragging up or down increases or decreases the saturation of the selected color. And dragging left or right changes the hue. Dragging at an angle changes the saturation and hue simultaneously. A black arrow in the grid indicates the delta from the original color. To reset the control point, right-click on it. You can also make changes on the mesh itself. Just drag the control point to a new location. Additionally, if you hold down the Option or Alt key and click on the control point, you get a preview in the viewer of which colors are being affected by your adjustments. When you make an adjustment, you'll notice that adjacent control points along the spoke appear with a black outline. These are lock points and prevent neighboring colors from being changed as you warp the color. Once you release your mouse, the control point you are manipulating becomes locked. To reset a control point, right-click on it. You can also do the same for lock points. Lock points along the edge of the mesh are always locked and cannot be unlocked. Another way to make a selection is with the Range tool. A gradient shows the range of hues in the warping grid. Click and drag across the red field, and all control points that correspond to that range of color become selected on the grid. This is a great method for selecting a range of colors for uniform manipulation. Drag to the left and upward to warp the red to a saturated yellow. Click the Reset button to return the grid to its original position. Because color grading is often about subtlety, I often prefer less drastic adjustments. Click the Select-Deselect button twice to reset the selected state of the warping grid. Click on the lake bed. A single control point representing that color becomes selected. Drag the control point toward the center of the wheel to remove the reddish cast. The lock points ensure that neighboring reds in the gas tank, her hand, and in the mile marker are not affected. Move your pointer over the blue sky region in the viewer. Notice in the mesh that the control point that is selected is not the exact color that is being sampled, as indicated by the red cross. For this, we'll need to change the resolution of the grid. By default, it's a 6x6 grid. Using this menu, you can choose to increase or decrease the resolution. A good rule of thumb in choosing a grid resolution is, if your footage is lower resolution, for example, 8-bit with 420 color sampling, then choose a lower resolution grid to avoid artifacts while maintaining smoother color transitions. However, if you're working with high-resolution footage in 10 or 12-bit with 422 color sampling, you can use a high-resolution grid to achieve incredibly accurate color adjustments without degrading the image quality. For this tutorial, you're working with 8-bit footage, and you'll notice that the image will begin to fall apart if you push it or pull it too far. That said, you need to see why a high-resolution grid gives you more precise control. By choosing a 16x16 grid, then moving the sample eyedropper over the sky, you can see that a selection box now falls exactly along the blue color vector representing the sky. Instead of selecting just one control point, select the pencil tool, then drag inward along the spoke, starting from where the furthest blue trace begins. Click and drag on any of the selected control points. Dragging away from the center of the wheel increases the saturation of the sky. Dragging toward green gives the sky a more stylized look, as does dragging toward purple. Notice, however, because of the footage you're working with, you can see the visual artifacts begin to appear if you go too far in one direction. I'm going to move these back in line with the spoke and push the saturation up a bit. You can also ease off on your adjustment by using these smoothing controls in the lower part of the palette. Each time you click the Smooth button for saturation, it moves the selection closer to its original position relative to the center of the warping grid. These buttons basically allow you to refine your adjustments when dragging with a mouse becomes cumbersome. Let's make one other change to this image. The sky is looking a bit too red, and I want to push it towards orange. Move your sample eyedropper over the lower sky region to see where those colors fall on the mesh. Select the arrow tool, then drag a box around the middle section of the spokes in the red vector area. If you've selected too many control points, you can Command-click to deselect them, or conversely, add more control points to your selection. Drag them to the left into the yellow region, then upward to boost the saturation. Press Command or Control-D to see a before and after. Hopefully you can see just how powerful the color warper can be, and I've only scratched the surface of what you can do with it. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to work with lookup tables, or LUTs, to create some interesting looks for your projects.